The first time Etta Ramsey noticed the shingles were missing from the schoolhouse roof, she was standing on her desk trying to catch the rain in a cast iron pot, and she thought to herself that if this was what teaching in Caldwell, Kansas looked like in the spring of 1878, she might have made a terrible mistake. She had come to Caldwell from Wichita with a small trunk of books, a letter of appointment signed by the county school board, and a determination so fierce it had surprised even her own mother. Etta was 24 years old. With dark hair she pinned back each morning with 2 tortoiseshell combs, and eyes the color of strong coffee that had a way of making students sit up straighter without her having to say a single word. She was not a large woman, but she carried herself with the kind of quiet authority that made people listen, and she had wanted to teach since she was 7 years old, and had corrected her own schoolteacher's arithmetic on the chalkboard in front of the whole class. Caldwell was not Wichita. Caldwell was a cattle town sitting right up against the Kansas Indian Territory border, and in 1878 it was still rough around every edge. The cattle drives came through in summer, drovers spending wages they had earned over months of hard riding, and the saloons along the main street kept their doors open until the small hours of the morning. There was a sheriff named Horace Dupree who was a decent enough man, but had more trouble on his hands than any 3 men could rightly manage. There were families homesteading on the surrounding land, breaking the prairie sod, planting wheat in the black earth, and praying that the weather and the market would cooperate at least once before it all broke them. The schoolhouse sat on the eastern edge of town, a squat building of board and batten construction, with a small bell tower that the bell had fallen out of 2 winters before Etta arrived. The previous teacher, a Mr. Hendricks, had lasted 1 full year and then written a letter to the board explaining that he had accepted a position in Topeka and would not be returning under any circumstances. The board had replaced him after a 4-month gap during which the children of Caldwell had run entirely wild, and they had been so grateful to find Etta Ramsey willing to take the position that they had neglected to mention the condition of the roof. She discovered the condition of the roof on her 3rd day, when a spring storm came rolling across the plains with the kind of speed that still startled her, accustomed as she was to the brick buildings of Wichita. The rain came through in 3 places. She caught 2 of them with the cast iron pot and a tin bucket. The 3rd dripped directly onto the corner of her desk and ruined the first half of a letter she was writing to her mother. She went to see Mayor Aldrich the following morning. Mayor Aldrich was a round man with a red face and an apologetic manner that he deployed so reflexively, it had stopped meaning anything. He told her that the town budget was stretched thin, that the cattle season would bring revenue, that he would see what could be arranged, and that he was terribly sorry about her desk. He offered her a handkerchief, which she did not need, and sent her back out into the street with nothing resolved. She stood on the boardwalk outside the mayor's office and looked out at Caldwell's Main Street, which smelled of horse and dust, and something faintly chemical coming from the direction of the tannery, and she made up her mind that she was going to fix the roof herself if she had to. She had no idea how to fix a roof. She was standing in Holt's General Store 20 minutes later, trying to determine how many shingles she would need and what tools were required, when she became aware that someone was standing behind her. She turned and found herself looking at a man she had not seen before, which surprised her, because in 3 days she had made it her business to at least register every face in Caldwell. He was tall, somewhere around 6 feet, with the kind of lean, capable build that came from years of physical work rather than any particular intention toward it. He had dark brown hair that curled slightly at the ends where it reached the collar of his shirt, and his face was weathered and angled, with a jaw that was clean-shaved except for a shadow that suggested he had started the morning with a razor but not quite finished the job. He was wearing a canvas work coat over a dark flannel shirt, and his hat was pushed back on his head in a way that suggested he had been working and had not bothered to reseat it properly. His eyes, when they met hers, were the particular gray-green of a Kansas sky in the hour before a storm, and they held a quality she could not immediately name. Not arrogance, not shyness. Something in between that looked very much like a man who had spent considerable time in his own company and was more comfortable there than most people were with other people. "You planning to shingle a roof?" he said. His voice was low and even without any particular regional music to it. "I am considering my options," Etta said, which was more dignified than yes. "You the new schoolteacher?" he asked. "I am," she said. "Etta Ramsey." He looked at her for a moment, and then at the bundle of shingles she had been examining, and then back at her. "Silas Stone," he said. "I run a spread about 3 miles east of town. The Hendricks girl was in your school." "I have not met all my students' families yet," she said. "I've only been here 3 days." "I know," he said. "I heard about the roof." She felt a small flush of irritation, not at him specifically, but at the idea that her predicament was already circulating as town conversation. "It is being addressed," she said, which was not precisely true. "By whom?" he asked, without any particular edge to it. It was a genuine question. "By the appropriate parties," she said, and heard how foolish it sounded even as she was saying it. He looked at her steadily for another moment, and then he reached past her and picked up the bundle of shingles she had been examining, and then a second bundle, and carried them toward the counter where old Mr. Holt was pretending to restock a shelf of tobacco tins. "I'll take these," he said to Holt, "and a pound of roofing nails, and whatever else I'll need for a job on the schoolhouse." Etta followed him to the counter. "Mr. Stone," she said, "I cannot allow you to purchase materials on behalf of the school. It is not appropriate." "I'm not purchasing them on behalf of the school," he said, without looking away from Holt, who was already moving to gather nails. "I'm purchasing them because there's a leaking roof and children sitting under it, and someone needs to do it. The mayor has said a lot of things to a lot of people over the years," Silas Stone said, and now he did look at her. And there was something in those storm-gray eyes that was entirely without bitterness, but also entirely without illusion. "The roof is still leaking." She stood there with her mouth slightly open, and watched him pay for the materials and arrange to pick them up the following morning. She could not decide if she was grateful or furious, and the uncertainty of it stayed with her all the way back to the schoolhouse, where she set up the tin bucket and the cast iron pot against the darkening afternoon sky, and thought about a man with storm-gray eyes who had simply done the thing that needed doing. He was there the next morning before her students arrived. She heard him before she saw him, the sound of boots on the roof and the rhythmic knock of a hammer. She stepped outside and shielded her eyes against the early sun and looked up at him, perched along the roof line with a confidence that suggested he had done this particular thing many times before. "Good morning," she called up. He looked down. "Morning, Miss Ramsey." "How long will it take?" she asked. He looked along the roof line, calculating something. "Half a day, maybe less if it stays dry." "Can I bring you coffee?" she asked, and then felt slightly peculiar about it because it seemed like the kind of thing you asked someone who was doing you a very large favor and you needed to acknowledge the debt in some small way. "That would be welcome," he said. She brought him coffee in a tin cup, and he climbed down from the roof to take it, and they stood in the morning light outside the schoolhouse, and she looked at him properly for the first time. He was perhaps 28 or 29, she thought, with a kind of careful self-possession that she associated with people who had lived through things they did not talk about readily. "You said you run a spread east of town," she said. "What do you raise?" "Cattle mostly," he said. "Some horses. I've got 40 head of longhorns and a small remuda I sell to ranchers up through the territory." "That's a substantial operation to run alone," she said. "I have a hand," he said. "Old fellow named Cotto. He was with the outfit I worked for before I bought the land. He decided not to move on when I did." She nodded. "And there's a Hendricks girl in your charge." Something shifted in his face very briefly. "My neighbor's daughter," he said. "Tom Hendricks and his wife Clara, they farm the section north of mine. Clara had a hard winter. She's still not entirely herself. I bring little Molly to school some mornings when Tom's work runs long." "That's kind of you," Etta said. He looked at his coffee cup rather than at her. "It needs doing," he said again, with the same plain simplicity he had applied to the roof. She found herself smiling at that. "You seem to have a particular philosophy," she said. He looked up, and something shifted in his face that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. "What philosophy is that?" "That if something needs doing, you do it," she said, without a great deal of discussion. "Discussion doesn't fix roofs," he said. He finished the coffee and climbed back up, and by the time her 12 students arrived at 8:30, the sound of the hammer had become a comfortable rhythm above their heads that made the youngest ones look up with wide, curious eyes at the ceiling. By noon, the roof was done. She went outside and looked up at the fresh cedar shingles laid in neat, overlapping rows, and felt something settle in her chest that had been anxious and unresolved since the first rainstorm. When she went back inside, she found that he had left a bill for the materials on her desk, with his name written in a hand that was plain and careful. The number at the bottom was what she had estimated the materials would cost, nothing more, nothing less, and there was a line at the bottom where she was supposed to sign. She added it to the folder of expenses she was assembling to present to Mayor Aldrich at the next town meeting, fully intending to ensure that Silas Stone was reimbursed from the school fund. Mayor Aldrich tabled the discussion of school repairs 3 meetings in a row, each time with a different explanation and the same apologetic expression. And by the time the summer came and the cattle drovers were in town spending their wages, Etta had stopped expecting the money to materialize and had started setting aside a portion of her own salary toward it. She did not see Silas Stone often through the summer. Caldwell in summer was a different place entirely, loud and fast and full of men on horses, and the bawling of cattle and the particular festive danger that descended whenever a large number of men with money and little restraint came to town. She taught her students through the heat of July and August, keeping the schoolhouse windows open and the lessons short in the afternoon when the heat made concentration impossible. And she began to understand that teaching in Caldwell meant teaching through everything the town threw at you, the cattle season and the weather and the unpredictable rhythms of frontier life. She saw Silas once in July, outside the livery stable, talking to a man she recognized as the sheriff. He saw her across the street and lifted his hat to her, and she nodded back, and that was all. She thought about him occasionally after that, in the way you thought about someone who had made a particular impression without exactly explaining themselves. She thought about those gray-green eyes and the plain way he had said that discussion doesn't fix roofs. In August, one of her students, a boy named Billy Marsh, who was 11 and the most naturally intelligent child she had encountered in her teaching career, showed up to school with a black eye and a split lip, and a story about falling from a fence post that convinced nobody. She dealt with that situation as carefully as she could, speaking to Billy's father, who was a decent man in a bad season with a temperament made worse by debt and a hot summer, and to Billy's mother, who was a quiet woman who had absorbed a great deal of hardship and was beginning to fray under the weight of it. The resolution was not everything she would have wished, but it was something, and Billy came back to school the following week with his face healed and his eyes a little more guarded than before. She mentioned it to Silas in September, when she saw him at Holt's General Store again. She was not sure why she mentioned it to him, except that he had the quality of a person who could hear difficult things without either dismissing them or catastrophizing, and she had found herself wanting someone with that quality to talk to. "There's not much justice to be had in places like this," he said carefully after she had told him the story. "Not for children, not for women, not for anyone without money or connections." He paused. "But you did the right thing going to the father directly." "Do you think it will hold?" she asked. "I think it depends on whether the season turns," he said. "Men under pressure do things they wouldn't otherwise do. If the Marsh farm pulls through this year, he'll likely be a different man come winter." "That's a very practical way of looking at moral failure," she said, not unkindly. "I'm not excusing it," he said. I'm explaining it, there's a difference. Yes, she agreed. There is. They walked out of the store together and stood in the September afternoon, and the air was already beginning to carry the first thin edge of autumn, the grassland going gold and the sky deepening to a blue so saturated it looked painted. "How is the roof holding?" he asked. "Perfectly," she said. "Not a single drop. I want you to know that I am still working on getting you reimbursed for the materials." He looked away out toward the street. "Don't trouble yourself about it," he said. "It is not trouble," she said firmly. "It's a debt and I intend to honor it." He looked back at her then, and there was something in his face that was almost amused, or something adjacent to amusement that she was beginning to recognize as his particular version of warmth. "All right, Miss Ramsey," he said. "As you like." He rode away down the main street and she watched him go, and noticed that she was watching him go and found that interesting. Autumn arrived in Caldwell like a long exhalation, the cattle season winding down, the drovers gone south, the town settling into its quieter winter rhythms. The October winds came off the prairie with a bite to them, and the cottonwoods along Bluff Creek turned the color of butter, and then rattled their bare branches at a November sky the color of pewter. Etta had made friends by then, or the beginnings of friends. There was Mrs. Dora Leavitt, the wife of the man who ran the drugstore, who was clever and funny and slightly bored, and who had adopted Etta as a project in the best possible sense, inviting her to supper and to the twice-monthly church meetings that served as Caldwell's primary social institution. There was also Pearl Holt, the daughter of the general store owner, who was 17 and had quietly informed Etta that she intended to go to the normal school in Emporia and become a teacher herself, which Etta found deeply satisfying. There was also the matter of Caldwell's school board, which consisted of Mayor Aldrich, a rancher named Foster Keene who never attended meetings, and a woman named Agnes Birch who was the most formidable person in Caldwell, and who had decided early that Etta Ramsey was exactly the kind of teacher the school needed, and had made it her personal mission to see that Etta was given every possible support, which in practice meant that Agnes Birch attended every town council meeting and asked pointed questions about the school budget in a voice that carried clearly to the back of the room. It was Agnes Birch who finally extracted the money for the roof materials from the town fund in November, standing at the council meeting with a written accounting in her hand and a look on her face that made Mayor Aldrich reach for his checkbook with the haste of a man, avoiding a large and determined weather system. Etta went out to the Stone Ranch the next morning to deliver the payment. She had borrowed a buggy from the livery stable, and she drove it east out of town along the rutted road that crossed the prairie toward the line of cottonwoods that marked where the land began to rise slightly. And she found the Stone place without difficulty, because it was exactly where she had been told it would be. A solid, unpretentious operation with a main house of hewn timber and stone, a good-sized barn, several outbuildings, and a yard that was orderly in the way of a place where things were maintained because they needed to work, not because of any particular concern for appearance. An old man was splitting wood near the barn. He looked up as she drove in, and she took him to be Cato, who was around 60 with a dark, weathered face and white hair and an expression of frank assessment. "Morning," he said. "You the school teacher?" "I am," she said. "Etta Ramsey, I'm looking for Mr. Stone." "He's in the south pasture," Cato said. "I'll send word." He looked at her with calm, steady eyes that had seen a great deal. "You can wait in the house if you like. There's coffee." She waited on the porch, because going into a man's house uninvited seemed presumptuous. She sat in one of the 2 wooden chairs that occupied the porch and looked out at the prairie, which in November was a tawny, wind-combed expanse reaching to a horizon that seemed impossibly distant, and she thought about the fact that she had chosen to come to this place, and that it was beginning, slowly and unexpectedly, to feel like somewhere she belonged. Silas Stone came around the corner of the barn 20 minutes later, pulling off his work gloves as he walked. He had been doing something that involved considerable physical effort. She could see that, and he stopped when he saw her and registered something in his expression that she thought might be surprise. "Miss Ramsey," he said. "Good morning," she said. She reached into her coat pocket and produced an envelope. "I have come to pay your bill. The town finally saw fit to release the funds." He came up the porch steps and took the envelope and looked at it and then looked at her. "You didn't have to come out here," he said. "I always deliver what I owe in person," she said. "It seems more honest." He turned the envelope over in his hands. "How did you manage it?" he asked. "Agnes Birch managed it," she said. "I simply provided the documentation." Something that was definitely not quite a smile, but occupied the territory adjacent to one crossed his face. "Agnes Birch is a force of nature," he said. "She is," Etta agreed, "and she is entirely on the side of the school, which makes her invaluable." He looked at the envelope once more and then slipped it into his coat pocket. "Will you have coffee?" he asked. She hesitated for one moment and then said yes. The inside of the house was not what she had expected, which was a space of pure function with no concessions to comfort or beauty. The main room was indeed functional, with solid furniture and a good cast iron stove that was putting out a comfortable heat. But there was also a shelf of books along the far wall, a good many of them, and a map pinned above the table that was marked with small notes in the same plain, careful hand she recognized from the bill he had left on her desk. There was a lamp with a good glass chimney and a braided rug on the floor and curtains at the window that looked as if they had been made by someone who cared about such things. "The curtains," she said before she could stop herself. He poured coffee from the pot on the stove. "My mother made them," he said. When she came out to see the place 2 years back, she was determined to make it look less like a lined shack. "Is she still in Kansas?" Etta asked. "Missouri," he said. "She has a sister in Springfield." He handed her the coffee. "She wanted me to come back east. I wanted to stay here." He said it without particular drama, as a simple statement of the way things had been. "Why?" Etta asked. "What keeps you here?" He looked at her for a moment and then out the window at the prairie. "I can see clearly for 30 miles in every direction," he said. "In Missouri, the land closes in on you, trees everywhere. You can't see what's coming." He paused. "I like to know what's coming." She thought about that on the drive back into town. She thought about a man who had arranged his life so that he could see for 30 miles, who had built something solid on open ground, who paid attention to what needed doing, and then simply did it. She thought about the curtains his mother had made, and the books on the shelf, and the careful handwriting on a bill that had never actually been paid until today. She thought about him through November and into December, when the first real cold came and the prairie turned iron gray, and the children came to school bundled in coats and scarves, their breath steaming in the cold air of the schoolhouse until the stove got going. She saw him at the Christmas social that Agnes Birch organized in the town hall, a large and energetic gathering that served as Caldwell's principal celebration of the season, with music from a fiddle player named Garrett, who was also the town's deputy and played with more enthusiasm than precision, and food contributed by every family in the territory, and dancing that started formal and got considerably less so by the later hours. She was talking to Dora Leavitt when she saw Silas come in, with Cato beside him and the Hendricks family, Tom and Clara and little Molly, who was 6 years old and had been one of Etta's most eager students since September. He scanned the room with those gray-green eyes, and she was not watching for the moment when his gaze found her, but she felt it when it did, a small, specific awareness in her chest that she chose not to analyze too carefully. He came across the room to say hello, and she introduced him to Dora, and they talked about inconsequential things, the winter wheat and the price of cattle, and whether the snow would be bad this year. And she noticed that he stood close enough to talk comfortably in the noise of the room, but not so close as to be improper, and that he listened when she spoke with the particular quality of a person who was actually registering what you said rather than waiting for you to finish so they could speak themselves. He asked her to dance when Garrett launched into a reel and she accepted, and they danced with the practical competence of two people who had both learned at a young age and had not forgotten, and she noticed that his hand at her waist was steady and certain without being presumptuous, and that he moved well for a man his size. "You dance better than I expected," she said, which came out more bluntly than she had intended. He raised an eyebrow. "What did you expect?" "I'm not sure," she said. "Something more agricultural." He laughed then, actually laughed, and it transformed his face in a way that made something in her chest do something she was not ready to acknowledge. "My mother taught me," he said. "She insisted. She said a man who couldn't dance was a man who couldn't be trusted in company." "She sounds remarkable," Etta said. "She is," he agreed. "She is also entirely right about most things, which can be difficult to live with." The music ended, and they stepped apart with propriety, but he stayed beside her for the rest of the evening, and they talked about his books and her students, and the particular challenges of making a life in a place that was still becoming itself. And she found that she was having a better time than she had expected, which was something she intended to think about later. Winter settled in fully in January of 1879, and Etta taught through the cold months with her stove burning and her students bundled, and the schoolhouse became a kind of warm center in the frozen world, a place where children came and learned things and went home again carrying something more than they had brought. She did not see Silas through most of January and February, which was the nature of winter on a working ranch. Everyone hunkered down and managing their own affairs, and she was busy enough with her teaching and with the small social world she had built around herself that she did not think about him every day. Only most days. March came the way March always came to the Kansas plains, which was unreliably and with a sense of personal grievance, alternating warm days with blizzards, and turning the roads to mud that sucked at wagon wheels with vindictive enthusiasm. It was in March that the second winter storm found the weakness in the schoolhouse roof that the first repair had not addressed, a section at the back where the original boards had been inadequate beneath the shingles, and where the weight of an exceptional snowfall combined with a subsequent warming and refreezing had worked the wood apart. Etta discovered it on a Monday morning when she arrived to find a section of the back ceiling sagging with absorbed moisture, and a cold, wet smell in the room that told her the damage was more than superficial. She closed school for the day, sent a note to Mayor Aldrich that was rather more direct than her previous communications, and then, because she had learned something in the 7 months she had lived in Caldwell, she went directly to Holt's General Store and sent word out to the Stone Ranch. Silas arrived the next morning in a wagon with Cato and a load of lumber. He climbed up and pulled back the damaged section and stood in the March wind looking at what was underneath, and then he climbed back down and told her what it needed, which was more substantial than shingles. The underlying board structure at the back of the building had been inadequate from the beginning, he said, and the only right solution was to do it properly. "How long?" she asked. 2 days, he said. "Maybe 3 if the weather turns." "What will it cost?" she asked. He named a figure for the lumber. She wrote it down. "And your time," she said, "and Cato's." He looked at her steadily. "Don't worry about that," he said. "Silas," she said, and realized it was the first time she had used his given name, and he registered it. She could see that. "I will not allow you to donate your labor." "I'm not donating it," he said. "I'm just not charging for it." "That is the definition of donating it," she said. He looked at her with that expression she had come to recognize, the one that lived adjacent to amusement. "Miss Ramsey," he said, "the mayor isn't going to pay for my labor any more than he paid for the first set of materials before Mrs. Birch extracted it from him. If I charge for my time, you'll have a bill that won't get paid and I'll have a school with a bad roof on my conscience. This way is simpler." She could not find an immediate argument against the logic of that, which irritated her. "I will find a way to compensate you," she said. "Bring us dinner at noon," he said. "That would be welcome." She brought them dinner at noon, a pot of bean soup from Mrs. Leavitt's stove and a half-dozen biscuits she had made herself before school that morning. They ate in the shelter of the wagon, out of the March wind, and she sat on the wagon bed and talked with both of them. And she found that Cato was a man of considerable intelligence and observation, who had clearly decided, during their first meeting, that Etta Ramsey was someone he approved of. "He doesn't bring people lunch on a working day," Cato said to Silas, jerking his chin in Etta's direction, and Silas gave him a look that would have shut down most conversations. But Cato was not most conversations. "That's because most people don't bring us soup," Silas said. "That's what I mean," Cato said, and focused serenely on his biscuit. The repairs took 3 days because the weather did turn. A sharp cold snap that sent temperatures back below freezing and made working on the roof a miserable proposition. But Silas was there each morning and worked until the light went. And by Thursday, the back of the schoolhouse had a new structural framework under fresh boards and fresh shingles, and the ceiling inside was solid and dry and smelled of new wood. She stood in the empty schoolhouse Thursday evening, after the students had gone home and Silas and Cato had loaded up the wagon and Cato had climbed up onto the seat with a deliberately oblivious expression. And she said thank you in a way that she hoped conveyed everything she meant. All the gratitude that was larger than the practical task he had completed. Gratitude for the fact that he showed up and did the work without making a great occasion of it, without requiring her to explain why it mattered or convince him it was worth doing. "You're welcome," he said simply. He was turning his hat in his hands, she noticed, which was the only thing about him that ever gave away anything like uncertainty. "I mean it," she said. "This matters to me. This school matters to me. These children have very little, some of them, and this building is the one place in their day that belongs entirely to their minds. I need it to be sound." He looked at her for a long moment, and she had the feeling he was seeing something, registering something that he was filing carefully away. "I know," he said quietly. "That's why I came." Spring arrived and softened the land, and the cottonwoods put out their new leaves along the creek, and the schoolhouse stood solid and dry through the April rains that came in long, blowing sheets across the prairie. Etta had 14 students now, 2 more than she had started with, the Garfield family having arrived from Ohio in February, and settled on a quarter section east of town with 4 children and a determination that Etta recognized and respected. She had also established, by spring of 1879, a routine with respect to Silas Stone that she did not entirely examine but was aware of. He stopped by the schoolhouse occasionally on his way through town, not frequently enough to be remarked upon by the more observant of Caldwell's citizens, and they talked, sometimes for 10 minutes and sometimes for longer, about his cattle and her students and the state of the territory and the books they were each reading, which turned out to be an overlapping interest of some significance. He had a set of the complete works of Dickens that he had acquired at some expense from a bookseller in Wichita, and she had the collected essays of Ralph Waldo Emerson that she had brought from her mother's house, and they began trading books back and forth in a way that was ostensibly practical and functionally intimate. She read Great Expectations in April with his marginalia in the margins, brief observations in his plain handwriting, and she found herself responding to them on small slips of paper tucked inside the cover, and they never talked about the fact that this had become a kind of conversation carried out at a remove, but it was, and they both knew it. In May, she went to a supper at the Hendricks farm, which Clara Hendricks had organized as a way of thanking the people who had helped her family through the hard winter. Tom Hendricks was a quiet man who had found the previous season punishing, between a failed corn crop and Clara's extended illness, and he had emerged from it thinner and with new lines in his face but with his fundamental decency intact. Little Molly sat beside Etta at supper and talked steadily about everything she had learned in school, which was apparently everything Etta had taught in the past 8 months, delivered in approximately the right order. After supper, when Tom and Clara were in the kitchen and Molly had fallen asleep on the settee, Etta and Silas sat on the Hendricks porch in the May evening, and she asked him about the book he had given her that week, a novel called The Return of the Native by a writer named Thomas Hardy that she had not previously encountered. "It's a sad book," she said. "It is," he agreed. "Do you like sad books?" He considered that. "I like true books," he said. "Some of them happen to be sad." "What makes a book true?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. The evening was warm and the fireflies were beginning in the grass, small cold sparks in the darkening field. "When you recognize something in it," he said. "Something you knew but hadn't said out loud yet." She looked at him. In the soft evening light, with his face relaxed and his hat off, he looked younger than he did in the sharp daytime and also more accessible, as if the day's necessary armor had been laid aside. "What did you recognize in that one?" she asked quietly. He didn't answer immediately. He looked out at the fireflies in the grass. "The feeling of belonging to a place," he said. "And the way that can complicate everything else. Do you feel that about this place?" she asked. "About the ranch?" "Yes," he said, simply, definitely. "I think I'm beginning to feel it too," she said, which surprised her to hear herself say. He looked at her then in the way that she had come to associate with the moments when he was paying the most serious attention. "About Caldwell," he said. "About all of it," she said. "The school, the people, the way the sky looks in the morning when the grass is wet with dew and the light comes across it." She stopped, feeling slightly exposed. "I came here thinking I was doing a temporary thing, that I would stay a year or two and then find a position somewhere more established. But now I think perhaps I was wrong about that." "What changed your mind?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. "Many things," she said, "but partly conversations like this one." He looked back at the fireflies. A muscle in his jaw moved once, and she had the impression he was choosing his next words with more than ordinary care. "Miss Ramsey," he said. "Etta," he paused. "Would you allow me to call on you formally?" "Not," he stopped and began again. "I am not good at making speeches. I am better at doing things than saying them. But I find that in this case doing requires some saying first." She looked at the profile of his face in the evening light, the angle of his jaw, the slight curl of his hair, the particular quality of stillness he had that was the opposite of inertness. There was a great deal of energy in that stillness, she had come to understand. It was the stillness of a man who had decided to hold himself in check until he was sure of what he wanted to say. "Yes," she said, "I would allow that." He exhaled very slowly, and she thought she saw something in his shoulders release. "Good," he said. "That's good." They rode back to Caldwell in the evening, side by side in the buggy she had borrowed, and the sky was enormous and dark, and salted with stars in the particular extravagant way that was only possible on the open plains, and she was aware of the warmth of him beside her, and of the fact that the conversation they had just had was a kind of door that had been quietly opened, and that they had both stepped through it. Summer came again to Caldwell, and with it, the cattle season and all its associated complications, and Silas Stone called on Etta Ramsey in the manner that the phrase implied, coming to the small house she rented from the Levitts on Vine Street on Sunday afternoons when the week's work was behind him, sitting in the front parlor with a correctness that Etta found slightly amusing and that she thought he found slightly constraining. And they talked and read and argued about books and about the state of the territory, and about the school board's continued inability to do anything practical about the school's equipment needs. He brought her wildflowers once in June, a bunch of them gathered from the creek bank, Indian paintbrush and blue sage, and something white that she did not know the name of, wrapped in a piece of brown paper. He held them out with the slightly gruff manner of a man who was doing something outside his established repertoire, and was committed to it anyway. And she took them and put them in a jar of water, and set them on the parlor table where she could see them. And she looked at him sitting in the parlor armchair with his hat on his knee, and felt something in her chest that was large and warm and specific, and entirely not frightening. In July he kissed her for the first time, which happened at the conclusion of a walk along the creek on a Sunday evening when the light was golden and the air smelled of grass and water, and it was preceded by a pause that lasted long enough that she nearly said something, and then decided not to, because she understood by now that he arrived at important moments in his own time and arrived at them fully. And when the moment came, it was gentle and certain and entirely itself. And she stood in the golden evening light and thought that she had been right about him from nearly the beginning. He asked her father's permission by letter in August, writing to Martin Ramsey in Wichita with a formality that Etta only learned about afterward, when her father wrote back to her with a letter that began with the observation that she appeared to have done well for herself, and ended with the instruction to bring the man to Wichita for Christmas so he could make his own assessment. She told Silas this, and he received it with the equanimity she associated with him, and said that he thought Christmas in Wichita sounded entirely reasonable. In September, the autumn came again in its long exhalation, and the cottonwoods turned gold along the creek, and one afternoon when Silas was helping her sort through a box of donated school supplies that had arrived from a church society in Topeka, she sat back on her heels and looked at him and said, without any particular preamble, "Do you think about the future?" He looked up from the box. "What future specifically?" he said. "Any future," she said. "Your future." "Our future, if there is such a thing." He set down the bundle of chalk he had been examining. "There is such a thing," he said quietly, "if you want there to be." "I want there to be," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Then I think about it," he said. "I think about it a good deal." "What do you see?" she asked. "Exactly this," he said, "but permanent." She held that for a moment, turning it over, recognizing it. "That's very like you," she said, "to answer exactly that precisely." "I could be more elaborate," he said, "but it would be less accurate." She laughed, and he looked at her laughing with an expression that she thought was probably the closest he got to what most people's faces looked like when they said they were happy. He proposed to her in October, not with any particular staging or ceremony, but on the porch of the schoolhouse on a clear fall afternoon after the students had gone home and the air smelled of wood smoke and dry grass. He came to her directly and took both her hands in his, which were large and rough and warm, and he told her that he loved her and that he wanted to spend the rest of his life in proximity to her particular quality of mind and her stubbornness and her laugh, and the way she could make 12 children pay attention with just a look, and that he understood he was not easy to know, and that he was grateful for her patience with that, and that he would like very much to be her husband if she was willing. She was willing, she was more than willing. She was certain with a certainty that sat in her chest like a warm stone, settled and permanent. "Yes," she said. "Silas, yes." He brought her hand to his mouth and pressed his lips to her knuckles, and she felt it all the way up her arm and into her chest, and she thought about the first morning she had seen him in Holt's General Store, picking up those shingles with the simple intention of doing something that needed doing, and she thought that she had been watching him show her who he was since that very first moment, and she had been wise enough, eventually, to see it. They were married in December of 1879, in the small church on the edge of Caldwell, which was full to its modest capacity with the people who had become their world in the past year and a half. Agnes Birch sat in the front row with an expression of profound satisfaction. Cato stood up as Silas's man, in his good coat, with his white hair combed. Dora Leavitt cried in a way that she would later deny. Little Molly Hendricks sat between her parents and clutched a small bunch of dried wildflowers that she had made herself for the occasion, because she had been told she was too young to be a flower girl, and had decided to be a flower girl anyway in a personal and self-directed capacity. Martin Ramsey, who had indeed come for the wedding, stood beside his wife and his daughter and shook Silas Stone's hand with the careful, measuring grip of a father who had not quite completed his assessment, but was prepared to be optimistic, and Silas shook back with the steady, unhurried grip of a man who had nothing to conceal and understood that time would demonstrate what words could only approximate. Etta's mother cried throughout the entire ceremony and said it was the cold affecting her sinuses. They went home to the Stone Ranch after the celebration, and it was Etta's home now, the house with the map on the wall and the shelf of books and the curtains Silas's mother had made, and she stood in the main room while Silas built up the fire in the stove, and she thought that she was where she was supposed to be, in this solid house on the open prairie where you could see for 30 miles, which meant you could see what was coming, which was exactly the kind of life she wanted. Winter held them close and spring arrived again, and Etta continued to teach. She had negotiated with the school board, using Agnes Birch as her principal ally and her own growing reputation as leverage, that her teaching contract would not be affected by her marriage, which was not universally accepted in 1880, but which she had argued for with such thorough determination that the board had ultimately agreed, largely because no one else wanted the position and they all knew it. She walked to school each morning from the ranch house, in all weather, or rode when the weather was too extreme, and Silas never once suggested she might want to stop, which she had decided before the wedding she would take as a requirement of the arrangement, and which turned out to be, as so many things about him turned out to be, unnecessary to negotiate because he simply understood. In the spring of 1880, the summer rains came early and hard, and by June the schoolhouse roof was holding perfectly, the repairs of the previous 2 years solid and well made, and she felt a particular satisfaction every time a storm came through and the ceiling above her students' heads remained sound and dry. In the summer of 1880, Etta discovered she was expecting a child. She told Silas on a Saturday morning in July when they were sitting at the kitchen table with their coffee, and the early light was coming through the east window, and she told him directly, because she was Etta Ramsey Stone and directness was her fundamental idiom. He sat very still for a moment, and then he set down his coffee cup with extraordinary care, and he looked at her across the table with something in his face that she had not seen there before, something that was large and raw and entirely unguarded, and then he reached across the table and took both her hands in his. He did not say anything for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, "Are you well?" "Very well," she said. He nodded, and something in him seemed to release and resettle like a man who had been holding his breath and had decided it was safe to breathe. "Good," he said. "That's good. You're going to need more words than that," she said, and was smiling when she said it. He looked at her steadily with those gray-green eyes, and then he stood up and came around the table and pulled her gently to her feet and held her, carefully and completely, the way he did everything, and she could feel his heartbeat against her cheek and it was fast. "I'm terrified," he said into her hair. "I know," she said. "So am I. It doesn't seem to matter." He held her tighter for a moment and then pulled back and looked at her face, and he was almost smiling. "You'll be extraordinary at it," he said. "At being terrified?" she asked. "At being a mother," he said. "You already know exactly how to make small people feel that they are seen and that they matter." She kissed him then, because he had said exactly the right thing, which he was better at than he gave himself credit for. The autumn of 1880 brought a new challenge to the schoolhouse, which was not the roof this time but the stove, which had been aging since before Etta's arrival, and which decided in October to give up its last pretense of function and refuse to draw properly, filling the room with smoke whenever it was lit. Etta was 5 months along by then, and her patience for the school board's chronic underfunding was running thin, which is to say thinner than usual, which is to say she appeared at the town council meeting with documentation, Agnes Birch, and an expression that made Mayor Aldrich reach for his checkbook before she had finished her opening sentence. The stove was replaced in November, a proper cast iron stove with a good flue, and the schoolhouse was warm that winter in a way it had never been before, and Etta taught through November and December with the comfortable knowledge that her students were not sitting in the cold, which was one fewer thing to worry about. She stopped teaching at the end of January of 1881, when the baby was close enough that the walk to school in the February cold was not practical, and she handed her class to Pearl Holt, who was 18 by then, and had completed a term at the Emporia Normal School, and was eager and competent and completely terrifying to the students in a way that was different from Etta's kind of terrifying but equally effective. She was at home when the baby came in February, with the midwife and Cato's wife, a woman named Ruby who had appeared at the ranch in November to help through the winter, and who had turned out to be the most practically capable person Etta had ever met. Silas sat in the kitchen throughout the entire event and drank coffee until he must have been vibrating, and Cato sat with him, and they did not talk much, which was appropriate for both of them. When Ruby came and told him he could come in, he was through the door before she had finished the sentence. Etta was exhausted and entirely herself, propped up against the pillows with a focus and clarity that the midwife remarked on, which did not surprise Silas at all. "You have a son," Etta said. He came to the bed and looked at the small, frowning, remarkable person in his wife's arms, and his face did something it had never done before in his life, which was open completely, all the careful management of expression gone, and Etta watched it happen and felt the fullness of it in her chest, like something that had been building for a long time and had finally arrived. "Hello," Silas said to his son, very quietly, as if he did not want to startle the universe into changing its mind. "His name is James Martin Stone," Etta said, "after your father and mine." He looked up at her, and his eyes were bright, and she felt that he would have said something if he had been able to organize it into language, but that the weight of the moment exceeded language's capacity, and so instead he sat on the edge of the bed and took her hand very carefully, the one that wasn't occupied with James, and held it. Spring came to the Stone Ranch and to Caldwell, the grass greening up from the brown of winter, the creek running high with snowmelt, the air full of the smell of new earth and wild plum blossoms. James Martin Stone, known almost immediately as Jamie, proved to be a person of strong opinions and considerable lung capacity, who slept in enthusiastic bursts and regarded the world with the focused, assessing gaze of someone who had arrived with a full agenda. He had his father's gray-green eyes and his mother's dark hair, and a chin that belonged to neither of them, and was entirely his own. Etta returned to the schoolhouse in April of 1881, leaving Jamie with Ruby in the mornings, which Pearl Holt received with relief because she had managed admirably, but was ready to go back to being a student teacher rather than the primary teacher. She taught through the spring and summer, and the school had grown now to 18 students, because Caldwell was growing, slowly and unevenly in the way frontier towns grew. More families arriving, more homesteaders proving up their claims, more children needing the education that opened the door to the rest of what the world had to offer. In the summer of 1881, a family named Okafor arrived from Oklahoma Territory and settled on a claim south of town, and their 2 children, a boy of 9 named Samuel and a girl of 7 named Ada, came to Etta's school. There were comments from some quarters of Caldwell that were ugly and small-minded in the way that ugly and small-minded comments always were, and Etta addressed them with a directness and a firmness that left very little room for argument, standing in front of her school board and explaining in plain language that her schoolhouse was for every child in the district, full stop, and that any arrangement to the contrary would require a new teacher because she would not accommodate one. Agnes Birch backed her without a moment's hesitation. Even Mayor Aldrich, who was not always on the right side of things but occasionally surprised her, nodded along. Samuel Okafor turned out to have a gift for mathematics that exceeded anything Etta had encountered in her teaching career, and she wrote to the county superintendent about it and received a scholarship application in return, and she sat at the kitchen table that evening and read it to Silas, who listened carefully and then said that if anyone could navigate that process, it was Etta. "It's not about me navigating it," she said. "It's about Samuel having what he needs." "Those are the same thing right now," Silas said. She worked on that scholarship application for 3 weeks, through 2 drafts, and Samuel Okafor received it, and his parents came to the schoolhouse on the day the letter arrived, and his mother held Etta's hands and her eyes were bright, and Etta felt that this was why she had come to Caldwell. This exact moment. The autumn of 1881 brought another visit to the schoolhouse roof. She had noticed it in August, a slight sag in one corner of the overhang at the front, where the recent hailstorm had done something unkind to the fascia board. It was not an emergency, but it was a problem developing toward one, and she mentioned it to Silas that evening over supper while Jamie sat in his chair and conducted independent experiments with a piece of bread. "I'll look at it Saturday," Silas said. "You don't have to do that," she said, and heard herself say it, and recognized that she said it every time and that they had established between them now the understanding that he was going to do it anyway, and that her objection was a formality they both observed and neither of them actually meant. "I know," he said, and went back to his supper with the air of a man who had said everything necessary. He went on Saturday, and Cato went with him, and Etta brought them lunch again the way she had the very first time, except this time Jamie came along, strapped to her hip in the carrier Ruby had made, and he regarded the roof proceedings with the alert, imperious expression that was becoming his signature look. Silas stopped work long enough to take Jamie from Etta's arms and hold him against his shoulder, and Jamie grabbed the collar of his father's coat in both fists and chewed on it, which seemed to satisfy him, and Silas stood there in the October sun holding his son and looking up at the section of fascia that needed replacing with the same assessing expression he used for every problem, practical and focused and entirely at home in himself. "It's not bad," he said to Etta. "Couple hours' work." "I thought as much," she said. "You're getting good at reading roofs," he said. "You have been an excellent teacher," she said. He looked at her over the top of Jamie's dark-haired head, and she saw that flash of warmth that lived adjacent to his almost smile, and she thought as she had thought many times before that she would never stop being glad that she had seen past the stillness to the depth of what was in him. He fixed the fascia that afternoon, and the overhang was sound before the October rains began, and the schoolhouse stood straight and true at the eastern edge of Caldwell through another winter. The years settled into the particular rhythm of a life that had found its shape and was filling it. 1882 was a good year for cattle, and Silas expanded the herd and hired a second hand, a young man named Esteban who was 20 and had come up from Texas, and who turned out to be exceptional with horses in a way that shifted the whole character of the Stone operation, because Silas began to focus more seriously on the remuda and the quality of horses he was producing, which was a market that paid better and was less brutal on the land than cattle. Etta's school grew. By 1882, she had 22 students and had written 3 letters to the county board requesting an assistant, and on the 3rd letter she received a response, which was not an assistant but was a promise of one for the following year, which she accepted as progress and Agnes Birch accepted as insufficient, and went to work on the county school superintendent directly. In the summer of 1882, Etta's mother came to visit and stayed for 6 weeks, and she and Silas reached, in those 6 weeks, the kind of understanding that was possible between two people who had both decided, independently, that the other one was precisely what they had hoped for. Mrs. Ramsey told Etta on the morning of her departure that she had been worried when Etta had come to Caldwell, because it had seemed like exactly the kind of place that could use up a woman and give her nothing back, but that she could see now that it had given her something back that she, Mrs. Ramsey, had not been sure actually existed outside of stories. "What's that?" Etta asked. "A man who sees you," her mother said. "Not just the surface of you, the whole thing." Etta held that on the drive back from seeing her mother onto the stagecoach. She sat in the buggy with the September air on her face and the prairie stretching out in every direction, and thought about what it was to be seen. She thought about the fact that she had been seen, from nearly the beginning, and that she had been seen clearly, in her stubbornness and her passion and her particular quality of caring about things, and that being seen clearly by someone who then chose to stay was the exact definition of what her mother had been trying to say. She turned the buggy toward home. In the autumn of 1882, the schoolhouse required attention again. This time it was the south wall, where the original clapboard siding had begun to separate from the frame, and the November wind was finding its way in around the edges. It was not the roof this time, but the principle was the same. The building had been built quickly and cheaply, as frontier buildings always were, and it was being slowly defeated by the Kansas weather, and the school board's budget was always insufficient, and the mayor's sympathy was always sincere and always accompanied by an empty gesture. And Silas Stone showed up on a Saturday morning with Cato and Esteban, and a wagon load of materials, and spent 2 days residing the south wall. He did not send a bill. She made him dinner both days, and they ate together on the bench outside the schoolhouse in the November cold with blankets over their knees, and she thought about the fact that this was what love looked like when it was real and working. Not grand gestures in peak moments, but showing up on cold Saturday mornings to do the thing that needed doing, year after year, not because it was required, but because it was right. She told him this, more or less, while they were eating. He looked at her in the November light with those gray-green eyes and said, "I do it because you care about it." "The school," she said. "Yes," he said, "and every child in it. And the idea that those children deserve something sound to sit under while you teach them." He paused. "Your caring about it makes it matter to me." She reached across the blanket between them and put her hand over his. He turned his hand over and closed his fingers around hers. "Silas Stone," she said, "you are a better man than you think you are." "You're biased," he said. "Absolutely," she agreed. "That doesn't make me wrong." The winter of 1882 brought news that the railroad's extension would reach Caldwell, which caused a significant and complicated realignment of everything in the town. Caldwell had been a cattle town whose primary function was as a terminus for the long drives from Texas, but the railroad's arrival changed the calculus of the entire region, because suddenly cattle could move more efficiently, and the character of the town shifted towards something that was simultaneously more connected to the rest of the country and more self-consciously its own thing. For Etta's school, the railroad meant more families, and more families meant more students, and more students meant that the promised assistant was no longer a promise but an urgent necessity. Agnes Birch appeared at the county superintendent's office in Wichita in person, which she had been prepared to do for 2 years and which produced, in the spring of 1883, the appointment of a young woman named Helen Cross as Etta's teaching assistant, who was 22 and recently certified, and so eager that she made even Etta slightly tired. Helen Cross was excellent with the younger children, and Etta reorganized the school into 2 groups and found that, with 2 teachers and 27 students, the whole enterprise ran with a smoothness that had previously been aspirational. She felt the expansion of her capacity and her students' outcomes, and was satisfied in a way that went all the way down. In the spring of 1883, Etta told Silas they were expecting a second child. He received this news differently from the first time, without the raw terror that had shown itself before, though she could see it was still present in some attenuated form. What was larger this time was the plainness of his joy, which had come to him gradually over the preceding years and now arrived easily, as if he had practiced receiving good things and had gotten better at it. "Good," he said, and pulled her close, and she felt him smile against her hair. Jamie was 2 years old and fully engaged in the project of testing every limit the world had to offer him, and he was enormously excited about the baby in a way that manifested as repeatedly placing his ear against his mother's stomach and reporting what he heard, which was apparently a great deal. The second baby was a girl, born in October of 1883, with her father's gray-green eyes and her mother's dark hair, and a disposition that was from the very beginning the opposite of her brother's expansive energy, a quiet, watchful quality that made her seem, from her earliest weeks, as if she was observing the world with a scientist's careful attention and was compiling her findings for a report she would deliver at a later date. They named her Ruth Agnes Stone. Ruth for Silas's grandmother, Agnes for the woman who had done more for Etta's school than any other single person in Caldwell. And when Agnes Birch was told this, she sat down in the nearest chair and was silent for a full 30 seconds before she stood back up and composed herself, and said that she was deeply honored and that the child would have access to every resource she possessed. Ruth Agnes Stone was 3 months old when Etta brought her to the schoolhouse for the first time, in January of 1884, and introduced her to the 28 students who were gathered around Etta's desk in a semicircle of barely managed excitement. Ruth regarded all 28 of them with her father's gray-green eyes and the impartial assessment she applied to all phenomena, and Samuel Acaffer, who was 12 now and whom Etta had been coaching through advanced mathematics for 2 years, very carefully offered the baby his index finger, and Ruth examined it and then closed her fist around it, and Samuel smiled with something that looked like relief. The schoolhouse roof held through the winter of 1884 without incident, which Silas reported to Etta in March with a quiet satisfaction that she shared entirely. "I think we've finally gotten ahead of it," she said. "5 years of work," he said. "You didn't have to do any of it," she said. He looked at her across the kitchen table where Jamie was doing his letters with a concentration that looked very like his father's, and Ruth was asleep in her basket by the stove. "I did," he said. "What kind of man watches something that matters fall apart and does nothing?" "Quite a few kinds," she said. "Not any kind I want to be," he said. She reached across and touched his hand. He turned it and held hers. In the spring of 1885, Caldwell was a different town from the one Etta had arrived in. The railroad had brought growth, and the growth had brought new faces and new commerce, and the particular energy of a place that was transforming itself into something more permanent, more complex, more layered. The saloons were still there, and the rough edges were still there, because the frontier does not domesticate itself overnight. But there was also now a proper bank and a doctor's office and a second church and a small hotel and a newspaper. The newspaper was called the Caldwell Courier, and it was run by a man named Oliver Stroud who had come from Cincinnati with a printing press and opinions. And in its second issue, it ran a piece about the Caldwell schoolhouse that Etta had not known was coming, and that was largely accurate, describing the growth of the school and the quality of its instruction, and mentioning, in a paragraph near the end, that the building had been maintained over the preceding years largely through the voluntary labor and materials of a local rancher named Silas Stone, who had repaired and improved the structure repeatedly without any compensation from the town. Etta read that paragraph 3 times. She went home that evening and put the newspaper on the table in front of Silas, open to the page. He read it once without any expression she could read. Then he set it down and picked up his coffee cup. "How did Stroud know?" she asked. "Cato talks," Silas said. "Cato is going to get a piece of my mind," she said. "Don't," Silas said. "He's been trying to tell that story for 3 years. He thinks I should be acknowledged." "He's right," Etta said. Silas looked at her steadily. "I didn't do it to be acknowledged," he said. "I know that," she said. "That's what makes you worth acknowledging." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "The mayor came to see me today." She sat forward. "He did." "He offered to pay for the work I've done," Silas said. Said the newspaper piece had been pointed out to him by several people who had opinions about the town's responsibility. A corner of his mouth moved. Agnes Birch had apparently been in to see him first thing this morning. "Of course she had," Etta said. "What did you say?" "I said the work was done and the materials were paid for long since, and that if the town wanted to do something useful, they should fund a proper expansion of the school building before the classroom got too crowded for anyone to learn anything." She stared at him. "And he agreed," Silas added. She stared at him for another moment, and then she began to laugh, a real laugh from deep in her chest, and he watched her laughing with that expression she had been seeing for 6 years now, the almost smile that was his fullest version of happiness. "I love you," she said. "I know," he said. "Say it back," she said. "You know it," he said, but he was almost smiling. "Silas." "I love you," he said, plainly and entirely. I have loved you since you were standing in Holt's general store trying to figure out how many shingles a leaking roof needed, looking like you were going to fix it yourself if it came to that." "I was going to fix it myself," she said. "I know," he said. "That's part of it." The school expansion was approved in the fall of 1885 and began construction in the spring of 1886, adding a second full classroom and a proper entryway with a wood floor, and a new outhouse that was an improvement on the previous one in every respect. The county provided the funds, and the contractor was a man from Wichita. But it was Silas who went out early on every morning. The construction crew was there to check the work and make sure it was being done right, standing in the spring mud with his coffee and his steady eye, asking questions that made the contractor's foreman slightly nervous and answer more carefully than he might otherwise have done. The expansion opened in September of 1886, and Etta stood in the new second classroom on the first day with 20 of her 29 students arranged around her and felt that something she had worked toward for 8 years had arrived. Not perfectly, never perfectly, but solidly. The way a good roof is solid. The way a sound building is solid. Built right, built to last, built against whatever the sky decided to throw at it. She had 31 students by the end of that school year, and Helen Cross, who had grown into a genuinely excellent teacher, managed the younger class with a confidence that made Etta feel the particular pride of having taught a teacher. Pearl Holt was teaching in Wichita by then, and Etta had received a letter from her in the spring saying that she had a class of 20, and that everything she knew about managing it she had learned from watching Etta manage hers, which was one of the finest things anyone had ever said to Etta, and she told Silas so, and he agreed. Jamie started school in 1886, in his mother's classroom, because Caldwell was not a large enough town to send him somewhere else, and because they had both decided that the best approach was to treat him exactly as she treated every other student, without any special consideration in either direction. He was 5 and fierce and intensely interested in learning, and he sat in the schoolroom and looked at his mother with his gray-green eyes and learned his letters and his sums with the focused concentration that was his father in miniature. He was not always easy to teach. He had opinions about methodology that he was not shy about expressing, and Etta had, on 2 occasions, sent him to stand in the corner for conduct unbecoming of a student, which he accepted with great dignity and which Silas, when told about it that evening, appeared to find considerably more amusing than was strictly appropriate. Ruth was in Helen Cross's class and was exactly what she had always appeared to be: quiet, observant, and capable of producing, when she chose to speak, observations that were so precisely accurate they made adults fall silent. She was 3½ when she came to school, which was younger than standard, but Helen Cross had met her twice and requested her specifically. The winter of 1887 was the hardest winter Etta had experienced in her 9 years in Caldwell. The blizzard that hit in January was the kind of event that tested everything: the town's infrastructure and the homesteaders' reserves and the ranchers' preparations. The Stone Ranch came through it without losing cattle, which was better than many, because Silas had prepared well and had the kind of intuition about approaching weather that came from watching the sky every day for years, and he had brought the herd in early and had the feed stored. The schoolhouse was closed for 2 weeks, which was the longest it had ever been closed in Etta's time, and when it reopened in February, she walked through it carefully and found that the roof had held perfectly, every section of it, the cedar shingles and the new boards and the proper structure that had been built up over years of seasonal attention. She stood in the cold, empty schoolhouse and put her hand flat against the ceiling at the tall place near the blackboard and felt the solid resistance of it, unchanged, unbowed, and felt something that was gratitude and pride together. She told Silas that evening. He nodded slowly. "Good," he said. "It should hold." "It will," she said. "I'm certain of it." He looked at her. "Because we built it right," he said. "Eventually." "Eventually," she agreed. "But we got there." She thought that was true of more than the roof, and she thought he knew that too, and she let the thought sit between them in the comfortable silence that was one of their most complete forms of communication. By the summer of 1888, Caldwell had grown considerably from the town Etta had arrived in a decade before. It had a proper main street with plank sidewalks and several established businesses. It had 2 churches and a school that was, by regional standards, genuinely good. It had families who had proven their claims and built something durable, and it had the particular character of a place that had survived its rough beginning and was becoming what it had always intended to be. The cattle drives were largely over by 1888, the railroad having changed the logistics of the industry and the Kansas quarantine laws having restricted the long drives from Texas. What remained of the cattle economy was local, and Silas had seen this coming and had shifted the Stone operation further toward horses, which was what the land was suited to anyway and what he was most skilled at. He had a reputation across a wide area for producing good horses, well-trained and sound, and he had buyers coming from as far as Colorado. Cotto was not well in the summer of 1888. He was 60-something. Nobody was entirely sure, and he had a chest ailment that the doctor had been treating since winter, and that was not improving. He was still at the ranch, still occupying the small house that Silas had built for him and Ruby 5 years before, still present in the daily life of the operation, but slower and quieter, and Etta was aware that this particular fact of life was coming toward them, and she watched how Silas moved around it, careful and steady, not denying what was there and not hurrying toward it either. Cotto died in October of 1888, on a clear autumn day with the cottonwoods at their most golden, which seemed like an appropriate arrangement. He had been sleeping more than waking for a week, and then one afternoon he simply did not wake up, and Ruby found him peaceful in his bed with the afternoon sun coming through the window. Silas came in and sat with him for a long time, and Etta came later and sat with Ruby, and there was nothing adequate to say and they did not try to say it, which was the right choice. They buried Cotto on the ranch, on the rise above the south pasture where he had liked to sit in the evenings and watch the horses, and it was a grave with a proper stone that Silas arranged, and the inscription was brief. Cato. He did what needed doing. That was everything. Etta stood at the graveside and read those words and thought about the first morning she had heard that particular philosophy, standing in Holt's general store with a man she hadn't yet understood, and she put her hand through Silas's arm, and he put his hand over hers, and they stood together in the October light. The school had 34 students by 1889, and the county had appointed a 3rd teacher, a young man named Albert Pierce, who was earnest and good with the older boys, and who played the fiddle better than Garrett the deputy, which was not a very high bar but was appreciated at social functions. The schoolhouse was full and warm and functioning, and the roof above it was the most solid structure in Caldwell. Etta was convinced, because it had been built and repaired and strengthened by a man who cared whether it held. In the spring of 1889, Indian Territory to the south of Caldwell was opened for homesteading in what would be called the Land Run, and the Oklahoma Land Rush brought a new wave of movement through Caldwell as people streamed south toward the new claims, and the character of the region shifted again, as it always did, as frontier regions always did, restless and becoming. Etta watched it from her schoolhouse window, the traffic and the energy, and the human tide of people going somewhere to start something, and she thought about herself coming to Caldwell 11 years ago with a small trunk of books and a letter of appointment, and she thought that the people going past her window had a great deal of uncertainty ahead of them and also a great deal of possibility, and she hoped for them the way she hoped for her students, that the thing they were building would hold against the weather. She was 35 in 1889, and Silas was 39, and Jamie was 8 and Ruth was 5 1/2, and the Stone Ranch was a going operation of genuine quality, And the schoolhouse had 34 students learning to read and think and add numbers and understand the world. And all of it was what she had meant when she had told Silas, standing on the Hendricks porch in the firefly evening of 1879, that she was beginning to feel she was where she was supposed to be. She still felt it, more every year. The summer of 1889 brought a letter that required careful thinking. It was from the county school superintendent in Wichita, offering Etta the position of district superintendent, which was a significant recognition and a significant salary increase and would require her to leave the classroom. She read it twice and set it on the kitchen table and told Silas about it at supper. He listened without expression, which was his way of listening carefully. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "I'm not sure," she said. "Part of me is flattered. Part of me thinks the district needs someone in that position who understands frontier schools from the inside." "That's you," he said. "That's also what makes it complicated," she said. "If I take it, I leave the classroom, and the classroom is where the work actually happens." "What does the position involve?" he asked. She described it: oversight of 12 schools across the county, teacher appointments, curriculum guidance, budget advocacy. He listened through all of it. "You'd still be doing the work," he said, "just for 12 schools instead of one. Or I'd be doing administration and the work would be done by others," she said. "You'd make sure they did it right," he said. "The same way you made sure the contractor built the new classroom right." She smiled at that. "Are you telling me to take it?" "I'm telling you what I see," he said. "You've been teaching Caldwell's children for 11 years and doing it better than anyone has. If you could do the same thing for 12 schools, that seems like more good in the world." She thought about it through July and into August, and she went to Wichita and met with the superintendent and asked pointed questions that made him visibly respect her. And she came back to Caldwell and told Silas she had accepted the position with conditions: that she would maintain her connection to the Caldwell school as its senior advisor, that Helen Cross would be promoted to head teacher, and that she would have real authority over curriculum across the district, not merely advisory input. The superintendent had accepted all 3 conditions. Helen Cross received the news with an expression that was equal parts excitement and terror, which Etta recognized as the correct response. "You're ready," Etta told her. "You've been ready for 2 years." "What if I'm not?" Helen said. "Then you'll become ready," Etta said. "That's how it works. You stand in front of them and you are responsible for what they learn and you figure out what that requires of you." She paused. "And you have 34 students who already know and trust you, an Albert Pierce and an Agnes Birch who will advocate for you at every town meeting for the rest of her natural life." Helen Cross straightened her shoulders. "All right," she said. The autumn of 1889 was Etta's first as district superintendent, and it was everything she had both expected and not expected. The complexity of 12 different schools with 12 different communities, and 12 different sets of needs, and 12 different versions of the same fundamental human situation. Children who needed good teaching and buildings that were sufficient, and teachers who were supported in doing their work. She rode to schools across the county through the autumn and winter, in the buggy when the roads were passable and on horseback when they were not. And she found things that needed fixing in every direction, not only roofs, though several of those too, but teachers who needed guidance and boards who needed encouraging and children who were not being reached by the instruction they were receiving and needed something different. She came home each evening to the ranch house, to Silas's steady presence and the children's complicated energy and the particular quality of a life that was both demanding and full. And she thought sometimes that the best thing she had done in her adult life, besides come to Caldwell, was to choose Silas Stone, or more accurately to recognize that he had chosen her, first and clearly, in the aisle of a general store on a March morning, when she was trying to figure out how many shingles a leaking roof required. In the spring of 1890, the Caldwell schoolhouse roof was found to need attention on the north side, where a winter ice dam had worked under the shingles in a way that was structurally familiar to everyone who knew the building's history. Etta, now as district superintendent rather than its primary teacher, heard about it from Helen Cross and went to look at it herself, and stood outside the building in the April morning and looked up at the north side roof line with the eye of someone who had been watching this particular roof for 12 years. She went home and told Silas. He drove over on a Saturday morning with their son Jamie, who was 9 years old and had, over the past year, taken to following his father around on working days with the focused, learning attention of someone who wanted to understand how everything worked. They brought the tools and the materials, and Silas went up on the roof, and Jamie sat at the base of the ladder, and Etta brought them both lunch at noon. She set the basket down on the bench outside the schoolhouse and watched Silas on the roof above her, moving along the roofline with the easy competence of a man who had done this many times, and she watched Jamie watching his father with those gray-green eyes wide with attention, and she thought that this was what endured, not the grand moments, which were real and necessary, but the ordinary ones. The Saturday morning with the tools and the materials, the lunch in the spring air, the sound of the hammer on the cedar shingles, the fact of a man who showed up, year after year, to the thing that needed doing, because the people he loved cared about it and that made it matter to him. Silas climbed down for lunch and took the sandwich she offered him and sat on the bench and looked at her. "You're thinking something," he said. "I'm always thinking something," she said. "A specific something," he said. She looked at the schoolhouse, at the fresh shingles on the north side, at the building that was solidly itself after all the years of work. "I was thinking that you have fixed this roof every season for 12 years, she said. "Not every season," he said. "Some seasons it didn't need it." "Enough seasons," she said, "and you never sent me a bill, not after that first one which I made you accept." "The town is responsible for the building's upkeep," he said. "I've simply been addressing the deficit between what they do and what needs doing." "You've been doing it because you love me," she said. He looked at her with those storm-gray eyes, and she saw in them everything she had been seeing for 12 years, the steadiness and the depth and the warmth that lived behind the stillness like a fire behind glass. "Yes," he said, "that's the more accurate version." Jamie was looking at both of them with the expression of a 9-year-old who was registering that something important was being said and was not entirely sure he had access to all of it. "Why do you fix Miss Helen's school?" Jamie asked his father. Silas looked at his son. He thought about it for a moment, and he gave Jamie the honest answer, the same answer he had given Etta in various forms over 12 years, which was the only kind of answer he knew how to give. "Because your mother cares about it," he said, "and because the children who go to school here deserve to have something solid over their heads while they learn, and because if something needs doing and you can do it, you do it." He paused. "That's true for roofs and for most other things." Jamie considered this with the gravity of someone filing it away for future reference. "I'm going to fix things when I grow up," he declared. "Good," Silas said. "Will you teach me?" Jamie asked. "I already am," Silas said. Etta sat between them in the April sun and felt the particular fullness of a life that had been built the way the roof above them had been built, with attention and care and the willingness to come back in every season and do the work that needed doing, not for recognition, not for payment, but because the people and the things inside were worth protecting. She put her hand over Silas's where it rested on the bench between them, and he turned his hand and laced his fingers through hers without looking away from the horizon. The prairie stretched out in every direction, the spring grass green and alive, the sky enormous and blue and clear, and you could see for 30 miles if you knew where to look. You could see everything that was coming. Ruth was 7 in the spring of 1890 and had declared, with the precision that was her particular gift, that she intended to be a doctor. She had made this declaration at the supper table on a Thursday evening in March, and Etta had looked at her daughter's composed, determined face and thought of herself at 7, correcting a teacher's arithmetic on a chalkboard, and had felt the deep satisfaction of recognizing something true. "Then you will be," Etta said. "Not common," Silas said carefully, "for women in medicine." "It is becoming more common," Etta said, And by the time Ruth is ready, it will be more common still." Ruth nodded as if this confirmed her existing analysis. "There are women in medicine now," she said. "I read about one in the newspaper." "You read the newspaper," Silas said. "Father," Ruth said with the patience of someone explaining something obvious, "I read everything." He looked at Etta across the table. She looked back at him. He pressed his lips together against something that was almost a smile. "She does," Etta confirmed. The summer of 1890 brought a particular satisfaction that settled over the Stone household like warm light. The ranch was in its best condition, the horses well regarded, and the operation sound. Etta's work as district superintendent was making genuine differences to 12 schools and the children in them. Jamie was growing into himself, curious and capable and clear-eyed, very like his father in his essential character, but with a verbal expressiveness that was entirely his mother's. Ruth was reading everything in reach and asking questions that made the adults around her think harder than they expected to. In September, Etta received a letter from the state school board in Topeka, commending her work as district superintendent and asking if she would be willing to serve on a state committee examining curriculum standards for frontier schools. She accepted without hesitation, because it was a chance to make the argument for what frontier schools needed at a level where the argument could actually change policy. She told Silas about it over breakfast. He put down his coffee cup and looked at her and said, "I'm proud of you." She stopped. He did not say those words often. He showed them constantly, in every practical way available to a person who expressed love through presence and action, but the words were particular because they were chosen carefully. "Thank you," she said, and meant it completely. "You came here to teach children in a leaking building in a rough town," he said, "and now you're going to Topeka to tell the state what frontier schools need." "I came here because it was the only position available," she said. "You stayed because you decided to," he said. "That was your choice. Everything after that came from that choice." She looked at him across the breakfast table, with the October sun coming through the window his mother had made curtains for, and Jamie's voice audible from the yard where he was helping Esteban with the horses, and Ruth's footsteps overhead where she was making her bed with the purposeful efficiency she applied to every task. "My second best choice," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "Coming to Caldwell was the best decision I ever made," she said. "Choosing you was the second best." "You didn't choose me," he said. "I chose you. We chose each other," she said. "That's more accurate," he agreed. She got up and poured more coffee, and he caught her hand as she passed, briefly, one moment, and then released it. And that was enough, because with them it was always enough. The small, certain gestures that had been accumulating for 11 years and showed no sign of stopping. The October air was sharp and clear, and the cottonwoods along the creek were turning gold, and the schoolhouse stood at the eastern edge of Caldwell with its solid roof, and its expanded classroom and its 2 excellent teachers, and 37 children were going to learn something that day, and tomorrow, and in every season to come. In the autumn of 1891, Silas climbed onto the schoolhouse roof for what felt to Etta like a routine visit, checking the north side repair from the previous year and the condition of the flashing around the chimney pipe. She stood below with her hands shielding her eyes against the October sun and watched him move along the roofline. And she thought about the first time she had done this, 12 years before, watching a man she had just met fix a roof for reasons she did not yet understand. And she thought about all the seasons between then and now, all the work and all the weather and all the life that had happened in and around the building below his feet. He came down the ladder and told her the roof was sound. The flashing needed new caulking in one place, he said, and he had brought what was needed to do it. "Good," she said. "It's a well-built roof now," he said. "It should hold for years without much intervention." She looked at him in the October light and felt a surge of something that was affection and gratitude and love all together. That particular combination she had been feeling for him for over a decade. And she reached up and straightened the collar of his coat in a gesture that was domestic and intimate and entirely characteristic of the 11 years they had been building a life. "You have given this building more of your time than the town ever had a right to expect," she said. "I gave it what it needed," he said. "Silas," she said, "you have fixed this roof in every season for 13 years. You have never sent a bill I didn't extract from you by main force. You have shown up in the spring and the fall and when there was damage and when there was a question, and you have done the work quietly and completely and without asking for anything in return." He looked at her steadily. "I know what I've done," he said. "I want you to know that I know," she said. "I want you to understand that I have seen every single time you came. Every Saturday morning and every cold November day and every spring morning when you climbed up there and looked and told me what it needed and then fixed it. I have seen all of it." He was quiet for a moment. "I know you have," he said gently. "That's why I kept doing it." She reached up and put her palm against the side of his face, and he turned into it slightly, an unconscious gesture, and she thought that this was what 13 years of love looked like. This ease, this knowing, this reaching and being reached for without any gap between the wanting and the arriving. "Take me home," she said. He put his hand over hers where it rested against his cheek. "Yes," he said. They went home to the ranch house on the prairie, where you could see for 30 miles in every direction, where the curtains Silas's mother had made were faded now and had been replaced twice. The current set made by Etta herself from fabric she had ordered from Wichita, where the shelf of books had doubled and then doubled again, and where the map above the table had new markings and new notes in 2 different handwritings, where Jamie's height was marked in pencil on the frame of the kitchen doorway from the age of 3 to 11, and where Ruth's collection of pressed flowers and her stack of medical pamphlets occupied a full shelf of her own, where the fire was always laid in the stove and the coffee was always on, and the particular warmth of a life well chosen suffused every room from the slate-floored kitchen to the bedroom, with the east-facing window where the morning light came in. They had a good evening together, the 4 of them, with supper and the conversation that was always interesting in a household that contained a child who asked questions and another child who had opinions, and 2 adults who had been talking to each other seriously for over a decade and had not run out of things to say. After the children were in bed, they sat at the kitchen table with the lamp between them, and Etta told Silas about what she was preparing for the state committee in Topeka, and he asked questions that pushed her thinking in ways she had not anticipated, because that was what he always did. Not the obvious questions, but the ones that came from having thought carefully about a thing from his own angle. She went to Topeka in November and made the case for frontier schools with the thoroughness and precision that was her professional signature, and she came home to the ranch on a Friday evening to find Silas waiting with supper on the table, and the lamp lit and Jamie asleep already and Ruth still awake and reading, which was typical. "How did it go?" he asked. "Well, I think," she said, sitting down and pulling off her coat. "The committee chair asked me to submit a written proposal. I believe they intend to use it." "Good," he said, and set a plate in front of her and sat across from her, and it was so entirely itself, so completely the life they had built, that she sat for a moment looking at it and feeling the weight of her gratitude. "Silas," she said. He said. "Do you know what I thought about on the stage from Topeka?" He looked up. "I thought about a man in a general store picking up shingles because a roof needed fixing," she said, "and how that was the beginning of everything." He looked at her across the table in the lamplight, and he was almost smiling, that particular warmth that she would know in any light, in any season, in any year of her life. "Not quite the beginning," he said. "When then?" she asked. "When you said I had a philosophy," he said. "Standing in the cold outside the schoolhouse with the coffee getting cold, you called it a philosophy. Nobody had ever paid that kind of attention to how I thought about things." She remembered it. The October morning, the 2 of them outside the schoolhouse with tin cups, and her saying, "You seem to have a particular philosophy." "I was paying attention from the first day," she said. "So was I," he said. "That's the thing." She reached across the table and he took her hand, and outside the window the Kansas prairie lay under a November sky full of stars, cold and clear and wide, and the schoolhouse stood at the eastern edge of town with its solid roof, and its warm stove and 37 children's names chalked on the board inside, waiting for Monday morning. And here is what was true about Silas and Etta Stone in the autumn of 1891, and for all the years ahead of them. They had found each other in a rough town on an open prairie, in the ordinary transaction of a leaking roof and a handful of shingles, and they had built from that ordinary beginning something that was extraordinary in the way that only quiet, enduring things are extraordinary. Not the kind that blazed and startled, but the kind that held against the weather, season after season, like a roof built right by someone who understood what was worth protecting. He would climb up and check the schoolhouse roof in the spring of 1892 and find it sound. He would do the same in the fall. And in some seasons there would be a repair, and in others there would not, and in no season would he send a bill, because the building was where Etta had built something that mattered, and anything that mattered to her mattered to him, and there was no accounting for love of that kind, no ledger that could hold it, no invoice that could adequately describe it. He came home in the evenings to a house that was full, and she came home to the same house in the evenings from whatever the day had required of her, and they sat together at the kitchen table in the lamplight and they talked about everything and sometimes said nothing. And the children grew, and the land grew, and the school grew, and the world turned in its slow, particular way, and all of it was what they had made it. Jamie grew up to be a man who fixed things without being asked, who had his father's gray-green eyes and his mother's voice, and who became the kind of rancher people called when they needed something done right. Ruth grew up to be a doctor, which she had declared she would do at age 7 with a certainty that permitted no revision, and she practiced in Caldwell and then in Wichita, and she was the first woman physician in 2 counties, and she was formidable and precise, and exactly what she had always been. Agnes Birch outlived the mayor and his successor and the one after that, and she attended every school board meeting until she was 81, and when she died, she left a fund in her will for the maintenance of the Caldwell School, which had been what she had been trying to arrange for 30 years. Cotto's grave on the rise above the south pasture had flowers on it in every season, because Ruby tended it, and because Jamie started doing it too when he was old enough, and eventually Ruth too, because it was the kind of thing that needed doing, and in the Stone family that was reason enough. And Etta Ramsey Stone taught and then supervised, and then shaped the education of children across a county, and then a state, and every time someone asked her how she had come to be the woman she was, she said that she had come to a rough town with a leaking roof and a determination to make it work, and that a cowboy had climbed up on that roof without being asked and fixed it, and then kept fixing it every season without ever sending a bill, and that she had understood eventually that this was the most honest thing she had ever seen, and that she had been wise enough to recognize wisdom when it arrived in work boots with a box of roofing nails. And Silas Stone, who was not a man who made speeches, would hear her tell that story sometimes at a dinner table or a county meeting, or to one of Jamie's friends who had asked about the old photograph on the parlor shelf, and he would sit quietly with his almost smile and think that she had gotten it right, as she generally did, but that she had left out the part where the real story was not the roof at all. The real story was the woman standing below looking up, shielding her eyes against the morning sun, with the coffee getting cold in her hand and that particular quality of attention in her face that had made the whole prairie feel, for the first time, like a place he could be fully himself. He had fixed the roof for the roof's sake. He had come back for her. And in the end, those 2 things were the same thing. The way love and work were the same thing when you were lucky enough to love someone whose work you believed in, and the way a good roof and a safe room and a fire in the stove and children learning their letters underneath, it were all the same thing, which was a life. A whole, sound, solid, enduring life. Built right and built to last, with the wide prairie sky turning overhead and enough room for everything the future intended to bring.